Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of City Lights Live. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis. Today's event is titled Close Reading Today and is part of City Lights' celebration of University Press Week 2025, which this year honors the many ways that university presses and authors team up to share ideas that shape conversations around the world. City Lights is proud to be partnering with Princeton University Press and State University of New York Press and a consortium of other university presses to amplify the voices of scholars researching the careful and sustained interpretation of texts. Close reading is an important practice within the field of literary criticism that encourages an appreciation of the liveliness and multiplicity of language. Today's discussion will honor the research of some of the leading scholars in their field. Moderating today's panel will be Samantha Rose Hill. She'll be joined in conversation by Yael Segalovitz, Dan Sinykin, and Johanna Winant. Samantha Rose Hill is the author of Hannah Arendt and the editor and translator of What Remains, the Collected Poems of Hannah Arendt. On today's panel will be Yael Segalovitz, who is assistant professor in the Department of Foreign Literatures and Linguistics at Gurion University at Negev, Israel. Also joining us is Dan Sinykin, the Winship Distinguished Research Professor of English at Emory University and the author of Big Fiction: How Conglomeration Changed the Publishing Industry and American Literature. And Johanna Winant, Associate Professor of English and Humanities at Reed College and the author of the book Lyric Logic, will also be joining us. So we have posted links in the event description with which you may purchase books by our program speakers. It is a great pleasure and an honor to welcome our esteemed guests. I will now turn the helm over to Samantha Rose Hill to begin our proceedings. Welcome to City Lights, everyone.
Welcome. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening talking about a topic that is very close to my heart and to the heart of everyone in this room, and I think is a topic that is becoming more important and more pressing by the day as well. So it's a wonderful way to honor Book Week by talking about the topic of close reading. And I'm looking forward to diving into these books with Johanna and Dan and Yael. I want to start us off tonight with, it's tonight here for me in France, afternoon for you perhaps, but I want to start us off with a simple question, a very simple question, which is, what is close reading?
It is
so, let us situate our readers definitionally as we dig into this topic. What is it that we're talking about? How do you define close reading? If you had to give me your definition.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. It's wonderful to be here and to be talking about close reading. Close reading is something that has historically been really difficult for people to define. I was in grad school, and on the first day of class, Modern American Poetry, the professor said to this room full of graduate students in literary studies, "What is close reading?" And all of us sat there and kind of looked around at each other and thought, we should know how to answer this. This is the foundational method of our discipline. And here we are on the first day of class in graduate school feeling baffled. And that was the point. That was the point that the professor in that moment was trying to make, was trying to say, look, this is a question that we as a discipline don't necessarily have a quick, tidy consensus definition of. And that lack of a definition is part of what was motivating me and Johanna to get going on our project. And so, in fact, we did come up with an attempt at a definition of our own, and I'll go ahead and give it to you.
Do you want to read it?
I want to read it.
Yeah.
You want to read it, Sam? You want to read it?
How about I read it and you tell me how it reads?
All right, you read it.
What is close reading? Close reading is the practice of paying attention to a passage of text to account for at least one aspect of its meaning and to make an argument about how it works.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. And the only thing that I like to add to that definition that we wrote is that it's important that reading also be elegant. One is attempting to make an argument, to offer understanding to the person you're speaking to, and to do it beautifully. So close reading is both about getting it right, having a strong interpretation, but it's also about writing, speaking, and thinking beautifully.
And I'll just add that in our book, Dan and I talk about close reading not as the practice of what you're actually doing when you're like casting your eyes over the words in front of you, following the plot, no matter how attentively, but what you are doing to produce a close reading, the noun, the thing that you are offering to someone else that results from you reading with attention.
It's really great to be here, I have to say, and I love also the semantic field that is beginning to kind of weave itself out. I think going back to what Dan said about the institutional history, maybe just say, that we know close reading to be institutionally formalized in the US through the New Critics. So kind of group of thinkers that worked in Vanderbilt, in Nashville, Tennessee, that really relied very heavily on I.A. Richards and others at Cambridge, and really kind of developed what we now think is close reading, a method that is the foundational method of engaging with textual materials in the discipline of literature. So it was also a kind of part of the institutionalization of the field. And I think it has remained very foundational, even though the new critical creed has kind of moved aside. But I want to say that what I think really kind of undergirds the close reading for me from the New Critics onwards is that it is an embodied approach to the text. So for me, the fact that there is no definition of close reading is less a challenge and more a clue. I would say we don't have a definition because it is something that is ingrained through practice. So it's a kind of, like you can say it's like riding a bike or like dancing, but it's more cognitive. So it's an effort that you do it again and again that centers on attention. You can see that Dan and Johanna also, spoke about close reading being first and foremost a mode of attention. So I would say if there is one definition, it is an approach to the text that is about deep attention, so acute concentration, a kind of submission to the logic of the text, to the logics of the other, to its style, its rhythm, its form of being. And what drove my project was to ask, what do we mean when we say attention? So it's a word that we so constantly refer to in association with close reading, but I really wanted to hone in and ask what it is that we think of in terms of mind and body when we think about attention to a literary text.
So I want to follow up on a couple of different points. So the two words that really, if I had to choose two words that echoed in my head as I was reading these books alongside one another, they would be attention and discipline. And so I want to ask you, Yael, can you say more about what embodied means? And I also want to just focus on these two words, attention and discipline, for a second, because I think they also relate back to something Dan was saying about the work of definition and the move toward elegance and beauty and what it is that we're doing. Attention, I always think of the Hebrew word kavanah, which also means prayer. So there's this almost monastic element to what it means to attend to something with intention, to give it time, to give it space, to come back to it through that act of repetition you were just referring to. And the other is discipline, which also has a theological root etymologically, to be a disciple, to engage in that process of self-scourging. And so can you situate us a little bit more historically, both within this kind of evolution of how it is we think about approaching a text, and what kind of act of devotion, I want to say, that might be? What is it that we're trying to the different angles, corners, I want to say elbows that we're moving around and trying to get at.
Yeah, I feel like I can speak for an hour in response to that really rich question. So I'll try
Please
to
do.
remain as short as I can. I think what I really found is that attention is really itself a historical and geographically, modifying signifier. So what the new critics thought about as attention is not what has happened to even the concept of attention in Brazil and Israel, as the very practice of close reading shifted geographically and linguistically, but attention also has a historical progress from the new critics as we see today, right? If we read other contemporary understandings of close reading and the word attention appears there, if you really dive into the theory of mind that is implicitly there, it's not necessarily the same. And I think what is interesting is that in defining this ostensibly very private personal mental state, you can actually see political pressures and cultural values really seeping into the definition of what I think of as mind-body, right? So you can see, for example, that for the new critics, they understand attention in a very specific way. So it is an active effort on the side of the reader, again, as I understand it, to kind of bracket what it is that they think of as the self. So bodily reactions or personal associations or idiosyncratic, memories that one should kind of put aside in order to become an empty whole, right? That in which the text could reverberate. So it is a mode of ethical submission, but it's also very Foucauldian, right? So it's acute self-discipline. So I think this is the paradox that I found, or the tension that I found in many of the definitions of attention. But I think what was also important for me, and this goes back to your kind of Hebrew etymology, is that if you go, that it seemed for the modern reader, and it seemed for me when I started writing the project, that attention and close reading or attention and reading were always intertwined. But if you go, for example, into kind of, again, the Jewish tradition, the exegetical tradition, that a lot of the time is assumed to also be one of close reading, it's not always the case, right? If you see, for example, just going to give one example, like in the Talmud and tractate Megillah, that really focuses on the scroll of Esther, they describe, right, modalities of reading. And they say, if you read the Megillah half asleep, it's totally okay. Still considered valid reading. But if you read it backwards, invalid, right? So it's not so much about concentration and attention and attempt to interpret rather than recitation. So you're speaking or you're chewing on the word of God. So what is important is to say the words in a specific manner rather than being mentally aware in a specific way. So again, kind of really reverberated actually with Dan and Johanna's book as I was reading theirs as well. So I'm fascinated to hear what they think of this.
Yeah, I'll just jump in too and say that, our book is really for people who are not yet disciplined into literary studies. And, we wrote it thinking about even the undergraduate classroom, but also potentially readers outside of the university who are curious about close reading and what this term that has been undefined for so long, usefully and in some ways not usefully for everyone, means. And I say that because, part of that that idea of attention being core to this disciplinary practice can have the effect that people who are struggling with close reading, struggling to know what close reading is and how to do it effectively, what someone else might mean by it, whether because it's not something that they were exposed to beforehand or did not have effective teaching about it, like whatever it is, that kind of like pay attention to the text can feel obscure. And so one of the things that Dan and I really tried to do in our book was break down close reading into steps that we saw most close readings take in the same order so that we could actually give people more specific ways of paying attention, both to the text and also to their own ideas, and make this sort of disciplinary practice more hospitable to more people.
Yeah, I'd say.
Can I interject really quick, Dan? Can
Mhm.
maybe or Johanna or Dan, can you just walk us through these repeatable moves that you outlined, the scene setting, the noticing, the
Yeah.
framing, argumentation,
Dan, do you
theorizing?
want to, or did
Because
you want to jump
you
in?
lay out a method for close reading. Maybe
Yeah. I'll put the two things I was going to say together. So,
thank you.
so there's the messiness of reading itself and the messiness of the process of trying to come to how one has a thought about what they've read. And one of the things, one of our contributors to this volume, Close Reading for the 21st Century, one thing they say in one of their essays that's co-authored, is that one of the things that a close reading is figuring out a way to say how you feel about a text. So how do you figure out how to say what you feel? And we often have many messy feelings about it. So it's a long process to get there, but our steps help you figure out how to rhetorically present that close reading to other people. And you begin by scene setting. That is providing whatever information your reader is going to need to be able to understand what's coming next. So say you want to tell someone why they should care about Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. First, you're going to have to tell them, if they've never read Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, you're going to have to tell them a thing or two about Virginia Woolf and To the Lighthouse so that they know what to where to fit what you're going to say about some passage in chapter 2. So you set the scene, then you notice a detail, a specific detail, a sentence, a word, a phrase, and you explain why that is worth noticing. That's the second step. The third step is you make a claim. You make a claim about that detail right there in that local context. Why does it matter to this paragraph that we understand this word that Wolf wrote in this way rather than that way? How does it change our understanding of the meaning of this passage? Fourth step is regional argument. That's when you scale up from that individual claim by noticing patterns across the poem, the play, the novel, to make an argument about the text as a whole. To say, because we have this claim about this passage in this chapter of To the Lighthouse, we can now build up to an argument about how to understand the entire novel. And finally, and this last step is one that most people don't get to until graduate school, is global theorizing. And that's when you build that argument about an entire text into a theory about a writer's oeuvre, about all of the works of Virginia Woolf. How should we understand her career? Or about a period, literary modernism, or about a genre, the novel. So essentially, how do you get from making an argument about the smallest detail in a literary text to making the most sweeping theoretical argument about the history of literature or about a genre or form? And for us, all of that does begin with a specific kind of attention that we encourage, actually, both attention to the text, but there's also this second level of attention that we argue is really important to cultivate if you're going to be a close reader. It is that is this trick of learning to have both attention to the text and allowing yourself, if possible, to have a kind of naive or immediate response to the text, and then also having a second level awareness or attention to your own experience. You're kind of watching yourself be a reader and be able to see, when are you shocked? When are you angry? When are you thrilled? And to watch yourself have those emotional moments and then pause and linger on them, slow down, so that you can investigate those moments where you find yourself moved by a text.
So I have so much I want to follow up on. There's two things in there. I'll throw both out. They relate to one another. The two words that I'm thinking about are touch and taste. So, as you're reading through, and that word jumps out at you, or that the feeling, that kind of aesthetic experience, we might say, where the text or the line or the word acts upon the reader and it catches them and then and pulls them back in. There's a language in these texts also about touching. And I think this is just to go back to embodiment and the relationship between embodiment and intention. And you both go to poetry in order to illustrate this in your examples. So these texts are we have the red wheelbarrow, we have Ashbury, we have Clifton, we have Pound, we have Stevens, we have Stein, Whitman, Dickinson. Can we talk a little bit about the connection between close reading and poesis, the making of the hands, in this material, tactile element that you're trying to, I want to say, almost induce the students into experiencing so that they can have that touch relation, that connection?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the ways that we do that is for the step that Dan called noticing, that we call noticing, right? It's scene setting, noticing, local claiming, regional argumentation, global theorizing. Those are the 5 steps. Oh, we were very pleased that the cover did sort of five colors.
I didn't notice that, actually. That's a nice, you have brick by brick.
Exactly. And for noticing, one of the things that we tell students to do is to point to the page, and that the detail they notice, as Dan said, should be like a word. Like it should be really there on the page and small enough to fit under your finger, not a diffuse vibe or style, or so an example of it. It really has to be there. It really has to be about, like, a centimeter square. And what we find with teaching is that if we do that, students are immediately propelled past summary and description and paraphrase into interpretation. So that's part of the restriction in noticing, right? We're not just noticing, like, I noticed this whole opening of this novel or something like that. And poetry, of course, works so well for this. So that's one thing. And then the other is that throughout the text, so just for people who haven't seen the book, Dan and I write a handbook for close reading in which we lay out these steps. We talk about what close reading is. We talk about what close reading does, that it offers argument, skill, and conversation. We talk about the history of close reading and the discipline. All of this is written for new members of the discipline, or members who are interested, people who are interested in literary studies outside of the discipline. And then we have 21 very short essays in which contributors analyze a favorite close reading. So many of those are about poetry. We try to have a balance of different kinds of genres and periods. So, for example, we have an essay analyzing Helen Wendler's close reading of Keats. And it encourages students, or anyone really, to sort of learn to read the way Wendler did, as thinking about every moment as a kind of choice. Which is a way of paying really granular attention to any work of literature, but of course works really well with poetry. Dan was talking about that second order, noticing, notice that your attention to your own attention. And one of the things I tell students all the time is, like, poems are super weird. Like, you can't really go wrong noticing any detail, because any detail can have that richness that sort of makes it feel like it's a little tiny keyhole that you're peering through, but through that tiny detail, you can see everything. And that works really well with poetry. Sometimes students find, at least I find, I teach a lot of poetry. I find sometimes that students are initially more anxious about interpreting poetry because it foregrounds that strangeness. It foregrounds its own weirdness, especially modern poetry. But moving past that, they very quickly realize that makes their own interpretation of poetry supercharged and easier than in many ways than something like a realist novel.
With this question about touch, I was thinking in particular of the chapter from the book by Becky Carver, who writes about the critic Angela Layton on the poet Alice Oswald. And this is all about, Angela Layton has a book all about hearing poems. And so this essay by Becky Carver begins, "I'm running up a stone spiral staircase in stilettos." And you can see at several levels, she's trying to invoke the sound that her shoes are making on the stone, but she's also writing in a way, stone spiral staircase in stilettos. She's writing in a way that's getting you to kind of hear and feel the language, the materiality of the language as you read her essay, which is about sound. And the way that the sounds, the tactility of the sounds are going to change the experience of what you notice, what you feel, and thus what you end up claiming about the meaning of poetry.
Mm-hmm.
I think actually that the question that you asked about poetry is more or less what organized the form of my book, How Close Reading Made Us, because what I loved or what I found myself attracted to are actually moments in which close reading fails. So the book is really organized around, the American new critics, and the Israeli ones and the Brazilian ones, but each such section is organized into, first, the way that these local intellectuals theorized close reading and attention, but then the second one is on texts that resisted or pushed against this protocol of reading that the reader comes with to the text. So thinking about touch as, a kind of bidirectional movement. So we sometimes forget that the text is also an agent. We can come with a specific expectation or embodied protocol or a series of steps, and some texts will just push against it. And I think it happens a lot actually with fiction. Because close reading works so well with poetry, it is like more longer, more convoluted or murky or difficult or spiraling texts that I feel really push the method to its brink, which is why I love, for example, to see the new critics reading Faulkner, because they get like into a whole mess. And you can see Clarice Lispector in Brazil, for example, who writes a very long novel in which the first chapter is really devoted to kind of bringing in, or I would say even seducing the reader, like this is a text that's going to work so well with close reading. And then the rest of the novel just completely exhausts the reader, like shifting completely away from this initial expectation. So actually, I think there's something about my move away from poetry that was about close reading at its worst, but also close reading at its best. I don't know, something about this tension.
I want to pull back the conversation for just a second because you just said twice, Yael, and Johanna said it 3 times when she was responding, that poetry is really good for this. And so why? Just walk us through a little bit of why. And I mean, I have follow-up questions, but I want you to tell our listeners why that's so strongly felt in the answer.
Yeah, do you want to go first? I have an answer too, but go. You want to take up this thing before?
I'll give my 2 cents on this. I think what I was most kind of, again, amazed by when I went to the texts is that the view a lot of the time of the new critics is that they were kind of very rigid, structured, neutral, almost scientific in their reading. And then I think I spoke to you guys before about this as well. I read the new critics themselves, and they were so gothic and like morbid and kind of infatuated with death and the question of like how the reader can deaden herself as she approaches the text, and their texts are like full of daggers and tombs. And I say this because Cleanth Brooks has this beautiful quote about why the poem is such a great place to go to for close reading. He writes, "The urn to which we are summoned is the poem itself." And then again, in someone coming to English, not as a native language, I'm like, what is an urn? Because everyone talks about this beautiful vase. And then I realized that urn is a place of burial. right? So when we approach and when we enter a poem, we're actually entering a realm of the dead, which again, I think is a little bit like a prayer, right? It's very evocative and you hear ghosts, etc. But I think it is a very closed space for him. It's like a tomb. And as Dan said, there's something about close reading that really is also very slow. And the amount of words, this sense of integrity to the text, this wholeness that gives a sense that you can encompass it by slowly lingering with it. And that's why I think, at least from my experience, when we try to close reading novel, which again, I think could be extremely productive, rich, interesting. And I do see, these encounters as fertile, but something also goes crazy in these encounters when you kind of go into a much wider space. Yeah.
I'm going to say a few things that are going to like sit a little uneasily with each other, I think. The first is that I want to be like clear that Dan and I in our book we do talk about the roots of close reading with new criticism, but we also follow it much beyond that. So we talk about, for example, like we have essays on CN9, Lauren Berlant, and Judith Butler as close readers. The second is that I am a scholar of poetry and poetics, and I love teaching close reading with poetry. And in my other book, talk about poetry as itself a form of close reading the world, of sense making. But that said, I find myself called at this moment to go to bat for close reading novels, because I think that's really important to do too. And for example, we have this amazing essay in the book by Stephanie Hirschenau, in which she is analyzing the scholar D.A. Miller's close reading of A Scene in Sense and Sensibility, in which Miller describes like what looks like, he describes what looks totally insignificant, a minor scene in which nothing happens, with a minor character who makes Eleanor and Marianne wait while he buys a toothpick case.
Toothpick case.
Yes. And it seems like this totally like throwaway scene, but based on close reading that scene, Miller assembles just an incredible argument about queerness and Austen's marriage plot and like the question of what he calls style with a capital S. And Stephanie Hirschenau in the book really shows how he does it. And that's an incredibly powerful close reading of a novel. And so, I think it is, although I love teaching close reading with poetry and like modern poetry and really small poems and figuring out how small poems can hold so much. I actually do think it's really important to say that close reading works beautifully in other genres as well.
The example I give sometimes that I gave in a piece I wrote called "Close Reading is for Everyone." The example of my close reading that I offered there was of a single line in Karl Ove Knausgaard's 6-volume My Struggle, and how one line unlocked the logic of 3,000 pages for me. So the scales.
What's the line?
I'm gonna have to. I would have to pull it up. I don't have it immediately to mind. But it was on the question of whether or not this book is all about authenticity and veracity, or if it's all about invention and lying. It's a work that people feel like is this sort of like shockingly honest portrayal of so many things, and yet it's there's a line that sort of unlocked for me the ways in which there's no way anyone could write this could write with such vividness about eating a bowl of cereal 7 years ago without having been completely enraptured by the powers of invention and imagination and fabulation and lying. So,
Mhm.
so yeah, it's anything from the two-line poem "At a Station of the Metro" by Ezra Pound to the 6 volumes of Karl Ove Knausgaard's "My Struggle" can be illuminated.
So I think I just want to make an observation that, I mean, NASCAR is interesting. I think the first volume begins with it's a chronicling of, I think it's death, but
Yeah, it goes
the
inside
leaping
of a
of
dying body.
inside the dying body. And Yael's example to answer this question was an urn. And Johanna's was the empty toothpick container purchased in the jewelry shop from Sense and Sensibility. So you've all picked empty objects which could be signifiers of capital O otherness, of death, container theory, languages of poetry. That might be a bit of a stretch. But the question brings me back to the history of the novel itself in a way. And, you know, when the printing press was brought to England in the late 16th century and the first, you know, books came up from the lowlands, and the first, you know, they were religious texts. They were religious texts that were printed. And the novel itself doesn't really, it's a pretty new technology. It doesn't even really come into existence till the height of the Industrial Revolution, the manufacturing of cheap paperbacks passed around. So I'm wondering two things. One, about how the history of the novel itself over time, moving from the reading of specifically religious texts to these literary narrative forms, has impacted the way we as readers approach the text alongside the changing material and historical conditions that have accompanied those technologies of production. Fair question, easy question. The other question, the other question, which is just, it's really, I was thinking about a bit earlier, Yael, as you were talking too, is, and then these two examples you both gave, and then Knausgaard, is if this attempt to define close reading, which of course is not really, I'm going to say definable, though I think definitions are well springs from which we begin the work of thinking. They're enticements. If what we're after here is not a kind of new form of eschatology, a way of thinking about judgment, which is another term that comes up in both books as well. Kant is a little bit of a ghost, aesthetic judgment, and thinking about how we judge a text, how we form an argument of a text. Does that make sense? And so there's an attempt to kind of reorient that away maybe from those positivist readings towards something else that's sneaking in here, I'm hearing.
I'd actually like to jump in really quickly first, Dan.
Johanna, then Dan, then Yael.
Okay, so first, I'm not going to take on all of that question, but I want to say Dan and I do offer a definition, but we actually offer it, I think, in the spirit of, I don't know if Dan agrees with this, with like thinking about like we've read Wittgenstein together. So like thinking about like what is
How was that for you?
Oh, it's great. But like thinking about like what is it that we are actually doing when we're close reading. So our definition is not us sitting around being like, how do people need to close read? Like what are people doing right and wrong? Actually, it's let's look at our practice in practice. What is it that people are doing when what are we doing when we close read? And that's how we came up with the definition that we offer, and that's how we came up with the steps. So it's not prescriptive in that way, that it's saying, you know, all close readings from henceforth must be like this. It's saying, let's look at the past 100 years or so of the modern discipline of literary studies and think about family resemblance. Like think about like, what is it that most close readings do in what order? So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The other thing I wanted to say about Kant was that I actually, like my sense of how Kant is lurking in our book has to do, and this is maybe like even Kant filtered through Stanley Cavell thinking about aesthetic judgment, but that when you offer an interpretation, like you have to believe it, like you have to stand behind it. You have to, in Cavell's words, like mean what you say, or like Lauren Berlant describes Stanley Cavell saying that you have to show up with your perspective. And that when we're talking about noticing, for example, like it's not evaluative judgment necessarily. It's not like this text is beautiful or true, or, you know, it's not, but it's a kind of judgment in terms of, I see this in the text and I want to share it with other people because I think they can see it too. That's so, I'll just sort of say those two things and then pass it off.
But I mean, can I just,
Yeah.
because maybe not everyone listening to this has a PhD in philosophy or literature, so you're cribbing Kant a little there to say
I
that,
am
you know,
cribbing Kant.
when we see a beautiful sunset, we feel this intense impulse to say, hey, come look at this. Come see what I see, which I mean, perception is part of this conversation too. But I'll pause there for a second so we can keep going.
I'll pick back up on that in a moment. In responding to the part of your question, Sam, that was about the relationship of the history of printing and the novel to close reading. John Guillory, who has a brief book on close reading that came out earlier in 2025, says, you know, there's a huge difference between reading closely and close reading. And we've been reading closely as humans for millennia. And you can trace that through many different traditions, especially scriptural traditions. And that close reading is a very modern invention that rises with the modern research university. And if you want to tie that into the history of the novel, for a long time, the novel was seen as a frivolous entertainment. The kind of thing that young people should be discouraged from spending their time doing, and certainly not something that is worthy of the kind of careful attention that one would give to the kind of object that one would either read closely or would close read. Now, that begins to change right around the same time that the modern research university develops in the late 19th century. So it's with Johns Hopkins University in the United States first in 1870 something, I think, that you get the modern research university. And it is in that context that close reading begins to find itself, eventually reaching the new critics and then disseminating out from there. Meanwhile, it's in the late 19th century, and especially in the figure of Henry James, that you really start to get a motivated defense of the novel as a form of art. The place these two things connect, and something we haven't exactly mentioned explicitly, I don't think yet in this conversation, is that one thing that close reading does is it treats its object as art. That is, it is an aesthetic practice in the Kantian sense. It is treating the thing you are studying as an end in itself. And so you can close read anything. I close read Danielle Steele, who has Pride of Place up here on my shelf, who many people would not think of as art. And so there's a reason close reading emerges with modernism through T.S. Eliot, and emerges in judgment from T.S. Eliot. We're going to close read those things that we judge as art, that we judge as the best art, and we're going to use close reading as a form of judging to tell you which art is the best. That is to say, John Donne is better than John Milton, and it's close reading that allows us to tell you that. What that is sort of bound up in, ultimately for me, my takeaway from that is that close reading is a practice that elevates the object. And you can elevate Danielle Steele as well as John Donne as well as John Milton, but what you're doing there is you're giving the object that you're studying the dignity of being an aesthetic object.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on that to say that I think what kind of comes out of what Dan just said, and that is really central to what I'm trying to show in the book, is that judgment is not neutral. It is itself historical and contextualized. and it is linked to modes of reading that has been institutionalized and then become kind of a cultural status quo. So if I come to a text with a specific expectation out of it, an expectation that derives from what I think is a good reading, and hence a book that would, come with me into that journey of close reading, then I would judge aesthetically in accordance with this expectation. And you can see, for example, so it's also a question of canonization. You can see in the Israeli context that Yehuda Amichai, for example, his poetry is celebrated by those people who kind of see themselves as the first figures of close reading in the Israeli university, really that is also developing at that time. But they completely disregard his prose fiction. And then when they do speak about it, they say it is like a wild tumor, like the metaphorical structure that is so beautifully built in the poetry gets out of control in prose fiction. So it's also about scale, and that scale is implemented into their expectations of reading, what it entails, what it expects of the text, etc. And one more thing maybe that I would add here in relation to what you said before, about the kind of theological reverberations that you can see in close reading, is that Faulkner has a really beautiful description. He says, in order to write, I have to close the door on outside noise in order to hear the voices that are haunting me, right? So again, it goes back to what we talked about before, like hearing and the ear, etc. So it's about kind of listening to whatever we think of as divine, right? Or either internal or external, but it is about kind of bracketing for him, or moving aside these stimuli in order to be able to hear another kind of form of being in the world. So I think it leaves maybe a kind of theological creed behind, but something about the embodiment of close reading. And I think, as Jan Johanna said, right, it maybe starts for me with new criticism, but moves much, much into the present. I mean, when you see surface reading being, pushed by Bast and Marcus, they claim we're, by touching the text or like giving it its autonomy, we are going back to the new critics, right? So kind of the way the approaching the text as an aesthetic object that really deserves its autonomy, deserves to have its voice heard without kind of consumption, is something that I think is with us still today.
There's a quote from Steiner's book, Real Presences, that comes to mind, where he says, when he's talking about that inner ear of listening that we can cultivate, and that often is cultivated in relationship to a great work of literature or poetry. I just heard my own aesthetic judgment in there, imagining what that great work is, that often, a kind of argument is not enough to capture the ineffable, but that we actually need paradox. And I know paradox is also something that it comes up in the book. I was thinking about, it's hard for me not to think about a little bit this political moment we live in right now, where it feels like irony is a bit dead, where it feels like paradox is a little difficult, where it feels like the form of the novel itself has actually slipped into a kind of orality over the art of the written form. And so I'm wondering how close reading as an ethical practice might help us think about some of these, what I want to call small d democratic goods, in thinking, and by attuning us to these what do we want to call them? It's not a skill, it's an enactment, it's that embodiment, it's that way of thinking with the whole self.
So I've been thinking a lot about this question lately, Sam. And the first thing I would say to it is that close reading is untimely. If you look at the wider world that we exist in right now, if you look at the amount of money, where all the money is going in our world right now, it's going to AI. It's going
Mhm.
to a mechanism that's trying to undo or destroy or annihilate everything that close reading dignifies.
Mhm.
It's attempting to take aesthetic objects and reproduce them in digested, pre-digested form that deracinates them utterly from the aesthetic, right?
Mhm.
And so close reading is untimely in 2025 because it cuts against, it resists and pushes back against everything that would try to make the world more efficient. It slows us down.
Mhm.
And within
Mm.
that slowing, this question of what are we cultivating when doing this practice that forces us to slow down, to linger, to revisit, to notice. Um, I've been thinking about this in terms of the old, going back to Aristotle, notion of the virtues. And
Uh-huh.
I've been thinking about the virtues. There are three virtues associated with ethics, epistemology, and aesthetics. Actually, virtues associated with the will, the body, and the mind that I think close reading cultivates in us. And I'll just real briefly, I'll tell you what this is a project that I've been spinning out from close reading. And I think there's the virtue of sensibility, an aesthetic virtue of what you were talking about in terms of touch, our ability to train our sensorium. I think there's a
Mhm.
virtue of accountability, the ability to account for oneself. That's an epistemological virtue, a virtue of the mind. And I think there's a virtue of gentleness. That's an ethical virtue. That's of being open or porous to the other. That's a virtue of the will. So these are ways I've been thinking about close reading as a practice of the moment that can cultivate things in us that we need now and are deprived of now.
Mhm.
Interesting that I also kind of felt that this project has led me to a very similar question, the to the one that you just proposed, and how different it is from where it took Dan. So I'm just kind of thinking aloud, because what I was interested in is auto theory. So this kind of genre that is emerging. And again, I was trying to ask myself, what kind of theory of reading does it proposes? So how does it educate or cultivate the reader into a specific kind of being? What kind of model of subjectivity or theory of mind does it propose? And for me, it was really interesting to see why they go back to very specific psychoanalytic figures that we haven't seen before. So Melanie Klein and Bion and Winnicott. And for me, it was about their political urge to try to create a very intersubjective subject or relational subject, one that really understands that interdependency is kind of basic to the human subject. And in that way, to try to kind of train, cultivate, invite the reader into that subject position that would allow, again, as Dan said, but from a very different point of view, a more porous understanding of the self, that we are always injected and are, seeping into others around us, and that this might cultivate a different kind of sociality or political realm, and a shift away from the autonomous, self-sufficient subject that seems to really dominate both authoritarian regimes and kind of, the ultra-capitalist society. So I don't know if it makes sense, but this is where I'm drifting towards with my thinking about the
does.
current moment.
Yeah. I'd like to just pick up on this really briefly too, because for me, the project with Dan didn't sort of drift into sort of thinking about questions about democratization or the democratic nature of close reading. For me, it really started there in many ways, because after my own like quite elite education at private universities, I found myself teaching at a big public university in a poor state, teaching like really brilliant, wonderful, ambitious, like thoughtful, just like terrific young people who had gotten themselves to their flagship state university and had never gotten feedback on their writing before,
Mhm.
in many cases. And had not sort of had the privilege of learning close reading by osmosis. And it turns out that for me, like I realized that that was actually a mark of privilege. And that I needed to figure out a better pedagogy to serve them. Because as Dan said in the title of, he wrote an essay recently called Close Reading is for Everyone. Close reading is for everyone. And in order for me to teach the students at my now previous institution in a way that I felt took them seriously, it involved figuring out how to support them in taking themselves and their own ideas seriously. And so for me, the origin story of the book really is in that desire for a process, a pedagogical process that would welcome them into this fundamental practice and give them the tools without assuming that they already had them.
The one of the threads I'm hearing between these answers, the word that I want to come back to is friendship, actually, or maybe just relation. Thinking about the intersubjective element, or thinking about the Aristotelian virtue of friendship, or thinking about what it means to create a space to read with others in the classroom. And for me, that is a kind of political argument, especially in a society that seems increasingly defined by forms of isolation. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on, it's not really a word that is present,
Yes.
but okay, you're like, yes, I've thought about this.
Yes.
You're not insane, Sam. You're not
I love this, because this is really also how I thought about, like, that one of the origin stories for the book for me was about respecting my students.
Yeah.
Which I did, but needed more. I could not teach them that all necessarily the way that I had been taught and the way that I was accustomed to teaching, right? That I needed to sort of up my game in various ways, bring more thought to my own practice. And then similarly, another of the origin stories of the book was starting to collaborate with Dan on a different project, and realizing that in literary studies, so often we do our projects alone by ourselves in the library with our books, and that it was incredibly rich and sustaining for me to be talking with Dan about what we were reading, what we were writing, what we were thinking. We first edited a special issue of a journal together. And then further, so then this was, the parts of this book that we wrote, as opposed to the contributors, we co-wrote. And that was really wonderful, and a real intellectual friendship. And then we sort of decided to widen it further, and we invited 22 more collaborators to contribute essays. And we are having a launch symposium in a couple weeks, and we invited the contributors, and they're like almost all coming. Like, they just, like, people really loved being part of this. And then we've kept going. We're now co-editing another special issue for another journal where we got to invite more people to participate. So for me, a huge part of the spirit of this book is that is working in sort of intellectual camaraderie and solidarity with other people. And what I'll just say, one thing we write in the book is that we read alone, but we close read with other people. We close read with the author of whatever it is that we're reading. Yeah, Dan's got it. Do you want to go for it, Dan?
Yeah, I would love to. I've got this all queued up, Johanna. We write, and our keyword, the keyword we use here that encompasses friendship as well, is conversation. And we say close reading should entail risk. Everything valuable does. We encourage you to take seriously the task of standing between and thinking with two other people. Someone has invited you to think with them, whoever wrote the text under consideration. Allow something about the text to matter to you. Write about what matters to you. You enter the conversation in good faith and invite a third, your reader. Each makes themselves vulnerable to misunderstanding, but the reward, if it works, is intellectual community.
I love this. I should say that, kind of with the friendship, I feel like and with Kant, I try to not mention Derrida, but he has been so central to my thinking that I feel like I cannot. So yeah, I think this for me, I mean, the ethics of close reading, as I said, like even being with the dead, with sounds, with the haunting of the past, it is not being alone. It is being alone in the presence of others. I really think this is what they're trying, the kind of a way, as Dan and Johanna also said, that reading, even in isolation, is always already a social action. And if you take history into account, it's also politically and ethically urgent. And I thought, Sam, if I can kind of bring you into the conversation as well, you know, your work on loneliness, and I heard one of your conversations, really, I think about Winnicott saying that how does a person become able with development to be alone? It is if caretakers are enabling him or her to be alone in the presence of another. Right. So
to be able to read alone in the presence of the mother.
Yeah, wow, beautiful.
Is
You
phrase.
see,
Sorry.
yeah, right. He says there's
Yeah.
no such thing as a baby. When there is a baby, there's always a caretaker there. So I'm really thinking about the fact that we have this illusion of isolation, of loneliness, as if there is a self-sufficient thing that is called the self. But we've got to let go of that illusion. And my sense was that something in contemporary, especially American, but not only texts, are really trying to push towards this kind of reading practice, or I would say even another iteration of close reading that really pushes friendship and collectivity to the fore.
And Walter Benjamin is echoing in my head a bit that, of course, the beautiful essay on the storyteller, in which he bemoans the novel as an isolating form of technology, where instead of sitting around, you know, the campfire telling stories collectively, building off of one another, we now all sit alone in our rooms with, you know, Danielle Steele was one of my first books that, you know, when I was like 8 years old. So, you know, it's just close to my heart too. But like, you know, reading our little novels and our stories. But part of what I'm really hearing here is actually a protest against that argument in itself, but also an invitation to the collective conversation to read together. And that, I think, within that is also, you know, a couple other elements that come out here is that, you know, challenging the temporality of the book itself, rethinking how we think about time and the way it structures reading, also productivity, going back to what it is we think it is we're doing when we're reading a book and saying what it's about, different forms of reasoning. In your argument, Yael, about how, you know, maybe we're looking for logic in the wrong places. I want to say that there are other places to look for ways of thinking that are not just within this kind of isolated scientific mode of reasoning that has a purpose, that has a productive end, but that this is really, you know, the old metaphor, weaving comes back, but it's really a kind of communal invitation, it feels like, as well. So how's everyone doing? I have more.
Doing great. Doing great.
I think we've been going for an
having a
hour.
great time.
I'm wondering, as I have more questions. One of the questions that I haven't asked that I really want to ask, and then we can start to move towards to closing up, and maybe I will ask some practical questions. But one of the things that both books touch on is this moment in time where, as a political theorist, I was taught to think of it as the break between philosophy and physics, which gets traced sometimes to Hobbes or others, or I was just at a conference where somebody was making the argument that at a certain point, philosophy actually changes hands to poets. And so we lose the thread of philosophy altogether, and philosophy tries to become like scientific reasoning. And so I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about these social scientists who have informed our institutionalized definitions of close reading, and how these books are really pushing back against those movements, which all three of you have brought up in different ways. But can we talk a little bit about maybe the reparation between these ancient quarrels and what it means to engage in practices of close reading in a classroom?
Can you say a little bit more about the social scientists that you're referring to?
So I was thinking of Kuhn, I was thinking of Carnap, I was thinking of these, I think it gets traced back to Hume in the book. And thinking about the different demands that get placed on reading between, I can put it this way, between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy would have been the way I was taught it, studying critical theory, which
I write
offers
a
its
little bit about
own
this
whole
in my other book, in Lyric Logic. But what I guess I want to say about it is that for me, like the ancient quarrel between poetry and philosophy was called the ancient quarrel in Plato's time, right? I mean, it's like already ancient then. And what I want to say about it is that I'm really invested in thinking about the things that precede or transcend disciplines, even as we are also thinking about disciplinary practice. So thinking about how we fit our disciplinary practice of close reading, for example, into conversations about sense making and reasoning. And so like in our book, we in Dan's and my book, we quote briefly a philosopher of science named Peter Lipton, who is no longer alive, but I think might be very surprised to have found himself in this context. Because he talks about explanation. He's talking about scientific explanation and what he calls inference to the best explanation. That's a term, that's what he's talking about. But he talks about different ways that things could be the best explanation. He talks about what would be the likeliest explanation, and also what would be what he calls the loveliest explanation, which would be the most explanatory. And we talk about how close readings are finding themselves between likeliness and loveliness as explanations in terms of their interpretive powers. Although close reading is the foundational practice of literary studies, that doesn't mean it has no relationship to other forms of interpretation or argumentation or reasoning or sense making. And although I firmly agree that it is something that turns something into an aesthetic object, one of the powerful experiences I've had as a teacher is that years after taking one of my classes, I had a student email me. She became a nurse. And she said, I write my notes to the doctors the way that you taught me to write close readings, and they always do what I say. She's thinking about like symptoms and interpretation and evidence and argument. She's not saying my global theorization is about genre or something, but there's a way in which I think that I'm interested in, I've put it this way before, so I'll just repeat myself, in finding demilitarized zones in ancient quarrels. Like, where is it that these questions meet and rub up against each other, and like an interesting points of exchange can happen.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say, I love the idea of like love being there in the quarrel, because this is the basic quarrel of my life. My father, who unfortunately passed away 3 months ago, was an astrophysicist. So he used to say, no, philosophy was great until science came along. And this was our love quarrel for years. But so I want to take this quarrel and make it, again, as Johanna said, like with more ancient context, to contextualize it a little bit and show, or maybe tell you a little bit about what happened with it in Brazil in the, arrival of new criticism, or specifically close reading. So Afrânio Coutinho, who was the intellectual who kind of traveled to the US and studied under the new critics, and then came back to Brazil. And you can see there the problem of internalizing the Western idea that the Brazilian is distracted. There is a problem there with analytic thinking. So he internalizes this idea and he says, listen, I found a cure for our problem of distraction. And it is it's called close reading, leitura exata. He said, if we practice it enough, we can kind of push away the savage, what he calls butterfly form of thinking, which is probably, for him, again, in a very specific paradoxical way, this is the problem of the Brazilian. So if we can just show the West that we can close read, then we would enter the family of the nations. So you can see again how the idea of what is analytic is itself a historical product. And Coutinho specifically pushes against another view. There is a very famous late 19th century novel in Brazil called Iracema that became kind of the basic nationalist novel. And it starts with an introduction to the reader, and it tells you, reader, you're probably in your hammock as you're reading this, like listening to nature and shifting from side to side and being almost asleep. And this is described as the most beautiful, productive form of engagement with literature. And Coutinho comes and says, we can't do this anymore. Like, we got to concentrate, we got to do this ray of light, we got to read analytically. So again, I was thinking about this time, I was like, what forms of logic are possible out there? How do we historicize what is analytic? What is proper thinking? Yeah. Go ahead, Dan. Or not.
There's another word that has been haunting the conversation, and I'm gonna use it as a wrap up question, and give everyone an opportunity to maybe make a final aesthetic judgment or judgment, and that word is beauty. So the word beauty has been spoken a lot in the past hour, and of course there perhaps many explanations for that. And I'm thinking back to where we started the conversation and attention. And this other word I think Dan brought in, which is risk. And so I want to ask, what does it mean to risk giving our attention to a text? What are we asking people to risk when we ask them to give their attention? And is there maybe a hope in there that it is beauty, that it is collectivity, that it is friendship, that it is a more expansive world? But maybe none of those things. But what is it that one is risking by engaging in this practice?
I love that question. And I'm thinking about those who I most often invite into this practice, which are students. And I think about the context that my students are coming from when they enter my classroom now, and the demands that are placed upon their time and their minds and their attention and their priorities, and how much of that has to do with an expectation of becoming successful in terms of making money, in terms of having the right kind of career, and how much they have been disciplined, many of my students in their lives, into habits of thought and mind that force them to hurry to the next task they have to do to get to the place where they are successful in some future point that may never arrive because they will always be hustling to the next thing. And so one thing we are asking them to risk with the text is to risk saying no to everything that has pushed them to become that creature of discipline that they have become so far, which is all the authority figures that have brought them here. So we're asking them to risk saying no to the forces that have created them. We are also asking them to risk, one of the things that close reading is, as I mentioned earlier in this conversation, is learning how to find the language to say how you feel about a text, which means you have to know how you feel about a text. And there's a vulnerability in that. And it's a vulnerability to oneself, and it's also then a vulnerability to anyone else that one is addressing in one's close reading. One has to be able to say, I'm going to open myself first one has to let oneself know. And I think we've gotten worse and worse in this as a culture of letting oneself know how one feels about a text. And then one has to let someone else know how one feels. And so it is risking saying no, and it is to society, and it is risking saying yes to one's own vulnerability.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is the riskiest endeavor of life, which is to surrender to the logic of the other, to not know where this text is going to lead you. And we all know that for most beautiful texts, in the beginning, you understand nothing. And if you want to understand, you're going to have to give in some way, and you don't know where you're going to end. And I think, again, thinking about what Dan just said, a lot of students come with very strong opinions and are very, are afraid. I mean, we all are, of encountering something that may destabilize these very strong opinions. But to be honest, if you really are going to surrender to a text, most likely something is going to shatter or break or crack or destabilize, and you might feel like you're falling, or that you're breaking apart. You will probably be formed together in this very beautiful way, but it is terrifying, I think, with other people and with texts. So, I mean, if you really take it to the ethical extreme, I think it's a huge risk of saying yes to the text.
Yeah, I think it's about trust, right? In some ways, I think this is a very similar answer or question, maybe too, to the friendship one. That to do a close reading, you have to not just like trust this process and the advice that Dan and I are giving in our book, for example, or even trust your instructor, or even trust your classmates, but you have to really trust yourself. And that's hard to do when there isn't a right answer on a multiple choice test. But instead, what you are going to sort of offer from yourself. And the reason I was thinking about it relative to the question about friendship too, is that doing it with other people is the only way to make this bearable, but also does also sometimes increase the vulnerability. Like when Dan and I are writing together, we will cross out each other's sentences, or, like really be like, no, like I need to say something like this here. And that's both, an experience of vulnerability and one of trust, because those two are entwined together.
Thank you so much for your beautiful answers. I feel very moved, but I feel like all of those responses are just so deeply human and necessary in our world right now, which can so often feel dehumanizing. And I just want to say that you have incredibly lucky students, and I wish I could be in your classes close reading with you, and perhaps hopefully someday soon in a cafe or a pub we can sit and read a poem together. So Thank you. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you
for
so
taking
much.
the
Yes, for
time.
that.
This is such a
Thank you
pleasure.
for-
Thank you so much.
Thank
It's
you.
wonderful. Thank you.
Well, much gratitude and respect to you all for that fantastic and very stimulating discussion. On behalf of City Lights, I'd like to offer our thanks to you for gracing our virtual halls. Samantha Rose Hill, you've been an excellent interlocutor, and thank you for doing the honors so thoughtfully and guiding the discussion along. I'd like to also thank Jeremy Wang Iverson for helping us make this afternoon happen. And for those watching, we have posted links in the event description with which you may purchase books by each of our speakers. We hope that today's event has inspired everyone watching to think about reading differently, to embark on the great adventure that reading can be. Today's event was made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture through our public events, our community and educational outreach, and our publishing program, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So thank you all for joining us. Be well, be kind to each other, and we hope to see you all again soon.